I've always been skeptical about stories that seem too good to be true. But what I witnessed 3 months ago in a small cemetery outside Denver completely changed my perspective on loyalty, love, and the bonds that transcend death itself. I was there conducting research for my graduate thesis on rural American burial customs when I first saw him, a small, weathered golden retriever mix, probably around 8 years old, sitting perfectly still beside a modest headstone. His coat was matted, his paws were worn, and there was something in his eyes that I'll never forget, a mixture of hope and heartbreak that seemed almost human. At first, I thought nothing of it. Dogs wander into cemeteries all the time, right? Maybe he belonged to someone visiting nearby. But as I continued my work, photographing headstones and taking notes, I noticed something peculiar. The dog never moved. For 3 hours, he sat there like a sentinel, occasionally placing his paw on the stone, as if trying to wake someone from an eternal sleep. When the sun began to set, I watched him stand up slowly, almost reluctantly, and begin walking toward the cemetery's main entrance. His gait was purposeful, determined. This wasn't a lost dog, this was a dog with a mission. Curiosity got the better of me, so I approached the headstone he'd been guarding. The inscription read, Margaret Eleanor Santos, 1943 to 2023. Beloved teacher, friend, and companion to all creatures great and small. Below that, in smaller text, forever with Buddy. Buddy. That had to be the dog's name. But what struck me most was the date. Margaret had died just 4 months ago. This dog had been making regular visits to her grave for months, and I was just now discovering this incredible display of devotion. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the image of Buddy's determined departure. Something told me this story was far from over, and I knew I had to return the next day to see if my suspicions were correct. Little did I know that what I'd stumbled upon wasn't just a heartwarming tale of canine loyalty. It was the beginning of a mystery that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the nature of love, memory, and the unexplainable connections that bind us even after death. I returned to Greenwood Cemetery the following morning at 7 a.m. sharp, determined to either confirm or debunk what I thought I'd witnessed. As I parked near the entrance, I checked my phone, 7:23 a.m. The cemetery was completely empty except for the groundskeeper, who was already tending to the flower beds near the chapel. Then, at exactly 7:30 a.m., I saw him. Buddy appeared at the main gate, walking with that same purposeful stride I'd observed the day before. But here's what absolutely stunned me. He wasn't coming from the nearby residential area. He was approaching from the highway, from the direction that led away from town. I quickly grabbed my camera and began documenting what happened next. Buddy walked directly to Margaret's grave, never hesitating, never getting distracted by other scents or sounds. It was as if he had an internal GPS programmed specifically for this location. He settled into his usual spot beside the headstone and assumed the same watchful position I'd seen yesterday. Over the next week, I established a routine. Every morning, I'd arrive early and position myself where I could observe without disturbing him. The pattern never varied. 7:30 a.m. arrival, hours of patient waiting beside Margaret's grave, departure at sunset. But where was he coming from, and where was he going? On day 8 of my observation, I decided to follow him. When Buddy began his evening departure, I maintained a careful distance and trailed behind. What I discovered left me speechless. This small, devoted dog was walking along busy highways, through industrial areas, across parking lots and through neighborhoods I'd never seen before. The journey took him nearly 2 hours of steady walking. Finally, he arrived at a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of town. I watched as he squeezed through a gap in a chain-link fence and disappeared behind one of the buildings. When I investigated further, I found him curled up in a makeshift shelter constructed from old cardboard boxes and tarps, tucked away behind a dumpster. Buddy was homeless. This incredible dog was walking over 8 kilometers each way, more than 16 kilometers total, every single day just to spend time with his deceased owner. He was sleeping rough, probably scrounging for food, enduring Colorado's harsh weather, all for the chance to maintain his daily vigil at Margaret's grave. As I drove home that night, my mind raced with questions. How had Buddy ended up homeless after Margaret's death? Why wasn't anyone caring for him? And most importantly, how did he even know where Margaret was buried? The pieces of this puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they were forming was more complex and heartbreaking than I'd ever imagined. I knew I needed to understand Margaret Santos if I was going to comprehend the depth of Buddy's devotion. The next morning, instead of heading straight to the cemetery, I drove to the Denver Public Library and began researching everything I could find about her. What I discovered painted a picture of an extraordinary woman. Margaret had been an elementary school teacher for 37 years at Roosevelt Elementary, just a few blocks from that run-down apartment complex where Buddy now lived. According to newspaper archives, she'd been known for her innovative teaching methods and her special connection with children who struggled academically or came from difficult home situations. But the most revealing information came from her obituary, which mentioned that she'd volunteered for over a decade at the local animal shelter. The article described her as someone who never met a stray she wouldn't help, and noted that she'd fostered dozens of rescue dogs over the years, finding them loving homes throughout the community. I needed to know more, so I contacted Roosevelt Elementary and spoke with the current principal, Mrs. Henderson, who had worked alongside Margaret for 15 years. Margaret was one of those rare people who made everyone around her better, Mrs. Henderson told me over the phone. She lived alone in that little apartment, but she was never really alone because there was always some rescue animal she was caring for. Buddy was different though. He was her permanent companion, not just a foster. She adopted him about 8 years ago when he was just a puppy, found abandoned in a parking lot. Then came the detail that broke my heart. When Margaret got sick last year, it was pancreatic cancer. She was absolutely devastated about what would happen to Buddy. She had no family, you see. She spent her final months frantically trying to find him a good home, but Buddy was so bonded to her that he wouldn't adjust to other families. Every potential adoption fell through because he'd escape and try to return to Margaret. Mrs. Henderson's voice grew quiet. When she died, there was no one to take him. Animal control was called, but somehow Buddy disappeared before they arrived. We all assumed he'd been taken in by someone in the neighborhood, but now I'm wondering. I told her about my discoveries at the cemetery and the apartment complex. There was a long silence before she spoke again. "My God," she whispered. "He's been living on the streets this whole time? For 4 months. And he's walking all that way just to visit her grave." As I hung up the phone, I felt a crushing weight of responsibility. I'd uncovered the tragic circumstances that led to Buddy's homelessness, but I still hadn't answered the most puzzling question of all. How did he know where Margaret was buried? Determined to solve the mystery of how Buddy knew Margaret's burial location, I spent the next day making phone calls to everyone involved in Margaret's funeral arrangements. What I learned would change everything I thought I knew about this story. I spoke with David Martinez, the funeral director at Peaceful Rest Funeral Home, who remembered Margaret's service vividly, but not for the reasons you might expect. It was one of the most well-attended services I'd ever handled for someone without family, he told me. Must have been over 200 people there. Former students, colleagues, fellow volunteers from the animal shelter. But what made it truly unforgettable was the dog. My heart stopped. Buddy was at the funeral? Not officially, David explained. About halfway through the service, this golden retriever mix appeared at the back of the chapel. Someone must have left a door propped open. He walked right down the center aisle, calm as you please, and lay down beside the casket. Nobody had the heart to remove him. David continued, his voice filled with emotion he was clearly still processing months later. When we moved the procession to Greenwood Cemetery, that dog followed the hearse the entire way. I've been in this business for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like it. He seemed to understand exactly what was happening. But here's the part that gave me chills. At the graveside service, Buddy positioned himself right where you've been seeing him, beside where we lowered the casket. When everyone else left, he stayed. We thought someone from the crowd would take him home, but when we returned the next morning to finish the burial preparations, he was still there, keeping watch. The funeral director paused before delivering the final piece of the puzzle. We tried to coax him away, but he wouldn't budge. Animal control was called, but by the time they arrived, he'd vanished. That was 4 months ago, and until you called, I had no idea what happened to him." Everything suddenly made perfect sense. Buddy hadn't mysteriously figured out where Margaret was buried. He'd been there when she was laid to rest. He'd witnessed the entire process, understood that this was where she would remain, and had been maintaining his vigil ever since. But as I sat in my car outside the funeral home, processing this revelation, I realized that understanding how Buddy knew where to find Margaret only made his story more heartbreaking. This wasn't just about a dog visiting a grave. This was about a creature so devoted, so loyal, that he'd endured months of homelessness, hunger, and harsh weather rather than abandon the one being who had shown him unconditional love. As I prepared to head back to the cemetery for what I knew would be a different kind of observation, I had no idea that tomorrow would bring a discovery that would turn this entire story upside down. The next morning, I arrived at Greenwood Cemetery earlier than usual, 6:45 a.m., hoping to capture some photographs of Buddy's arrival for the article I was planning to write. I positioned myself near Margaret's grave with my camera ready, expecting to see that familiar golden figure appear at the gate at exactly 7:30. But 7:30 came and went. No Buddy. At 7:45, I began to worry. At 8 o'clock, I was genuinely concerned. This dog had maintained the same schedule for months without fail. Something was wrong. I decided to walk to the apartment complex where I'd seen him sleeping, fearing the worst. Maybe he'd been hit by a car during his dangerous daily journey, or perhaps animal control had finally caught up with him. When I arrived at the complex, I found his makeshift shelter empty. But as I was about to leave, I heard voices coming from around the front of the building. Following the sound, I discovered something that made my jaw drop. There was Buddy, but he wasn't alone. He was sitting calmly beside a woman in her 70s, who was gently brushing his coat while talking to what appeared to be a veterinarian who was examining him on a makeshift table set up in the parking lot. "Excuse me," I called out, approaching the group. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I've been documenting this dog's story for months. Is everything okay?" The elderly woman looked up at me with eyes that seemed oddly familiar. "You must be the person who's been watching him at the cemetery," she said with a knowing smile. "Margaret told me someone would eventually notice." My blood ran cold. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" I said Margaret told me someone would notice Buddy's visits eventually. She was always good at predicting things like that. I stared at her, completely confused. "Ma'am, I think there might be some misunderstanding. Margaret Santos died 4 months ago." The woman's smile grew wider. "Oh honey, I know exactly when my sister died." I was holding her hand. "Sister. Margaret had a sister. I'm Eleanor Santosjan," she continued. "I live in Seattle, which is why I wasn't around when Margaret got sick. By the time I could arrange to move back to Colorado, it was too late. When I arrived for the funeral, I couldn't find Buddy anywhere. I've been searching for him ever since." My mind was reeling. "But why didn't you? I mean, how did you know he'd be at the cemetery?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Because 3 days ago, I finally went to visit Margaret's grave for the first time since the funeral. I couldn't bear to go before then. And there he was, waiting for her, just like she said he would be." She reached into her purse and pulled out a handwritten letter. "Margaret wrote this for me before she died, along with instructions about Buddy's care. She somehow knew that he'd find his way to her grave and wait there until I was ready to find him." As Eleanor handed me the letter, I noticed the date. It had been written just 2 days before Margaret's death. In shaky handwriting, Margaret had written, "Eleanor, when you're ready to let me go, you'll find Buddy keeping watch at my grave. He'll wait as long as it takes. Please take him home and love him the way he loved me. He's been my greatest teacher about loyalty and unconditional love." I looked down at Buddy, who was now wagging his tail and seemed genuinely happy for the first time since I'd started observing him. The veterinarian confirmed that despite his months of rough living, he was healthy and would make a full recovery with proper care. As I watched Eleanor load Buddy into her car for the drive to his new home, I realized that this story wasn't just about a dog's incredible loyalty. It was about a woman's final act of love, her faith that dedication and patience would ultimately be rewarded, and the mysterious ways that love finds a way to complete itself, even beyond death. Sometimes the most extraordinary journeys aren't measured in kilometers traveled, but in the courage to wait, to hope, and to believe that love never truly ends.